Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. As I've studied justice in the Bible, I've continued to be drawn to the Old Testament broadly, and to the prophetic literature from Isaiah to Malachi a little more specifically. This could be because I spent more time in the New Testament growing up, so it feels like there's more to explore in the Old Testament. But I think it's also because there are so many connecting points within the prophets. Through calls to return to the way of God, pronouncements of God's judgment, and really parallels I see between practices of the people of God then and now, it seems like a great place to plumb the depths of biblical justice. But as our guest today noted in an essay on the book of Amos, justice is never actually defined in the prophetic literature, but the prophets make clear what justice and injustice entail. Understanding what this means, how we can read the prophets and understand what justice and injustice entail as the people of God, forms the basis of our conversation with today's guest, Dr. Danny Carroll. Dr. Carroll recently retired as the Scripture Press Ministries Professor of Biblical Studies and Pedagogy at the Lifton Divinity School at Wheaton College, and will be moving into a Professor Emeritus role at the school. Dr. Carroll was one of my Old Testament professors at Denver Seminary, and what I appreciated from his teaching was both his understanding of justice and ethics within the Old Testament, and his ability to convey the narrative of Scripture, the way stories and themes connect across the text. With this in mind, while the focus of our conversation today is on justice and the prophets, you'll see how these texts and the actions of the prophets connect both to the law before them and to the ministry of Christ after them. You'll also learn why the law and worship of God were so closely connected for God's people in Israel, and how that understanding impacts us today. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. Danny Carroll. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Dr. Carroll, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thanks. It's always good to be with you, Eric.
We talked last time about immigration, and then the conversation was in August, released early September, I think. Okay. And then things went crazy here on immigration.
Yes.
In Minneapolis.
Yes.
So I was glad that we had kind of started having that foundational conversation.
Yes.
Back then. But now we're switching up to sort of your other, I guess, academic area, working in the Old Testament and thinking about what justice in the Old Testament looks like. I'm curious, just an overview. We're going to, I think, focus mostly on the prophets, but when you think justice in the Old Testament, just kind of broadly, what sort of themes come to mind?
Well, I'd preface it by saying this. Justice is central, to the character of God. I mean, so a classic passage for all this is Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, where it focuses on the grace and mercy of God, but also the justice and judgment of God. And they all go together. I mean, so for some of us, I think justice is like an add-on. We really want the blessing part. But really, the justice piece is just as central. So I would say, first of all, we have to realize just how central it is to the person of God. Therefore, it should be central to our understanding of our faith. And justice, people like, kind of a one-liner, definition, and I'm not good at that. But what it focuses is on, it's a combination not just of justice in a legal sense, where people get their due, which is kind of what often people think that, people get their due, which is part of it. But biblically, justice, on the one hand, when you're talking about the victims in a certain context, now you're looking at being aware of and having compassion toward the vulnerable. On the other hand, justice, another component of justice is judgment. So even if we think about our own legal system with all of its imperfections, you can see both of those trying to play themselves out, where you're trying to be fair or compassionate to those who are vulnerable or who are victims, but there can be no justice in the sense of making things right without the sense of punishment for those who abuse the vulnerable or exploit the system. And even if their engagement is not direct, they're still taking advantage of the system, which in itself is unjust. So you've got these various components that need to be understood, and not only the components of it, but the levels of it. So you and I can have a just or unjust exchange or relationship, but that also functions at multiple social levels, whether you're talking about, the tax system, or where you're talking about local police, or all these different levels of justice, which you also will find in the ancient world. I mean, it's functioning at, they won't have as intricate a set of rules and laws and societies as we do, but you'll see in the prophets where they're hitting at individuals for being unjust, but they're also hitting at the monarchy, and they're hitting at the marketplace. They're hitting at nation states. I mean, so you're seeing the whole justice discussion occurring at multiple levels, with all these different components. And so, a one-liner, that's kind of hard. It's more of a kind of a global concept, that permeates all of our social realities.
Yeah. And I think that's appropriate from what we've heard from other people on the podcast in terms of trying to find just a one line, simple definition. Like it doesn't end up working out that way because there's so many different components. So
Mm-hmm.
it almost ends up being more of a narrative or a story of
Yep.
how do we describe what justice is
Yeah,
kind
that's
of
good.
broadly.
That's good.
So I recently read an essay of yours in a book called The Bible and Social Justice, kind of talking about Amos. And a
Yeah.
lot of the themes, I think, from that essay have already shown up here in your response. So I'm glad there's some congruence there.
Yeah.
But one of those is justice as sort of a characteristic of God,
Mm-hmm.
also paired with how did I write this down in my notes? So justice compares also to legal matters, I think you said, with
Mm-hmm.
how it's laid out in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
What is this connection between how the law is laid out and the characteristics of God? How do we, I guess, see those characteristics, especially justice, in the way that the Old Testament law was written for the people of Israel?
Well, I think in a couple of ways, if you look at some of the laws, for the poor or the hungry, you need to put mechanisms in place. I mean, so it's not just kind of this ephemeral idea or concept. Necessarily, what happens is that gets put into legislation. And I think that's important. And there's a couple of things about Old Testament law that I think are important. On the one hand, we do this in our own way, but the idea of historical memory. So they'll say things like, do this or that because once you were slaves in Egypt, or don't forget that once you were slaves in Egypt, and so the role of historical memory. Now we do it in our own way with legal precedent, you know. So there's kind of that same idea that we learn from the past and we build off the past. But when you get into the Old Testament, it's not just kind of cold data. I mean, those historical moments actually reflect the heart of God. And so the law is trying not just to organize the people, which is how many people think, and it says, and law does organize a society. Otherwise, you have total chaos. Right? On the other hand, a law or a legal system is also, as most people don't think about it this way, it's also formative. Now, the way we will describe it is uh, if you want to be a good citizen, you need to obey the law. Okay, so what you're looking at, what does it mean to be a good American or a good citizen? And it's that you follow certain kind of rules, and the expectation is that you will do this kind of naturally, right? And so, you need to be trained in this. So if you're going to get a driver's license, you got to pass a test. And I mean, these kind of things. If you want to buy a piece of land, you've got to follow certain rules. I mean, all these things are laws put in place to organize the system so that it actually functions. But ideally, at the same time, it should be formative. Okay, formative of a social ethos. Now, you have the same thing going on in ancient Israel, except it's fundamentally religious. And so when you go into the laws, sometimes these are connected to religious feasts. Okay. And so there again, very clearly, you're seeing the connection between God and a certain set of laws, actually, because they're actually part of the ritual itself. So if you're celebrating certain ritual and then they say, be sure you invite, even the Sabbath law, it includes the widow and the orphan and the poor and the foreigner. I mean, so, they need rest too. So what you're seeing is not only is it saying everyone needs to take a rest, the people that are vulnerable in those populations, or like the widow and the orphan or the poor, or those who are exploited by the system, like the foreigner, should be treated equally. So what you're seeing is this formative aspect of the law, and oftentimes connected to their faith. And so that's why when you get into the prophets, what they're doing is they're wedding the critique of religion with the critique of injustice. Because if you violate one, you're violating the other, you see. And if you are doing or acting unjustly while still worshiping God, what the prophets will say is no, that's a disconnect. The God you call our God, Yahweh, or that's one of your own creation. So you see the rejection of both ritual and just injustice at the same time. And this is a long answer, so I apologize. But
It's all good.
okay, but what happens then? I notice I see this all the time. Is that because we don't connect the two, separation of church and state, which is kind of this American ideal. That's how we'll read the text. So we'll separate, you know, religion from society in a sense. I mean, so we'll talk about, oh, they just need to worship from the heart. Well, the prophets don't even use that kind of language. I mean, they're hitting at the rituals because they're hitting at the injustice. So it's not just, worshiping from the heart. It's like when James in the New Testament says, you say you have faith, well, show me your works. I mean, it's the same concept that they don't make that bifurcation that we do. So that's why when you see prophetic critique, they're going together.
Yeah, that is such an interesting. It's like things that I have heard and learned throughout academic study and whatnot. But the way that you just articulated that, I think, is drawing even more clearly why worship and the law are connected, because the law is part of the worship, or
Yes.
like you can't separate them with the way that
Yeah,
the law
and,
is
and
laid
what you
out.
find is that the ritual uh, prescriptions are embedded in the law itself, and vice versa. I mean, so even how you read it and find it in the Old Testament is in the law and the religion are mutually embedded, and so they don't make that separation.
Yeah. I'm curious to how we connect this to a conversation about idolatry. So, what
Mhm.
I remember from being in class with you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in my memory, is that your either prescription or description of what idolatry is less that, like, if we were to take money for an example, money is not the idol necessarily. The idol is the God we create that allows us to use money in an unjust way or in a way that is
Yeah,
opposite of the prescription of the
yeah,
character of God. Is
yeah,
that an accurate understanding of idolatry, or how does that play in?
yeah. It's interesting because sometimes Old Testament scholars are very linear, so they have a hard time seeing that idolatry can also be the idolatry of Yahweh by the people of God. So they'll go, oh, but the word for idol doesn't appear in that passage. That's what I'll read, And those there's actually several words for idol in the Hebrew. And so they say, oh, those words for idol only appear in relationship to other gods. And I go, yeah, but conceptually it's there. So even if this is technical, but even if lexically it's not there, conceptually it is. And so I gave some lectures at Truett Theological Seminary, which is at Baylor, in the fall of 24, I think it was. And they're coming out as a book this coming fall. And the title of the lectures, there was three of them. It's Of God and Idols. That's the title of the little book. And I connected into political theology coming out of the Old Testament. But there it is. I mean, so again, because we have this separation that we do, and because worship is of the heart, and we don't connect it necessarily. So we'll come up with other idols. We'll say, "Oh, the idol is money," or "Don't make your job your idol," or "Don't make your new car your idol." I'm going, they're not my idol. They may be my infatuation. They may be my obsession, but I actually don't sit there and kneel and ask that car to help me, you see. Or I don't ask, my house or my hobby, to save my marriage. I mean, I don't ask, my job to somehow, bring peace to the Middle East. I mean, but that's what we use. And so we don't understand this prophetic connection, you see, that what we're doing is we're worshiping ourselves because we create God in our own image, which is ironic because we're made in his image. But what we do is we make him in our image and then we worship him, you see. So we're actually worshiping our own ideals. And so you go into some churches, I don't want to make too much of a generalization, but let's say you go into one of these mega churches and they have a coffee shop and it's about the show. And, that works in kind of North American middle to upper middle class suburbs, you know, uh, and it's just reflecting the culture. And so when you walk in, it's kind of showtime, you know, professional singers and there's lights and everything is, very American efficiency. We start at the same time, we end at the same time, Um, I'll hear things like, God wants the very best, and so we need to have the best sound system and Well, uh, that sounds like American capitalism is what it sounds like. And it's being very human. I mean, humans have done this since the beginning of time. So yeah, so that's the danger where we actually worship ourselves, even though we won't talk about it that way. So it's not surprising that you get certain pastors that begin acting this out, where, they become untouchable and, beyond the law, and because they become the focus, you see. Um, and you have the parishioners or the churchgoers who really will lift him up as if he were some kind of special person when he's not, or she's not. So yeah, so that's, people just, they can't get their arms around that. But if we were to get our head around it, the implications uh, for our worship services, I think, would be profound.
Yeah. You talked about that lexical versus conceptual
Yeah.
thought process of scholars looking back into the text. Is that how do you feel like that works present day with this concept? Because it sounds like there is obviously a conceptual something conceptually is missing from that understanding, but it also sounds like maybe we don't have the language down for actually identifying
Hmm.
what idolatry is. How how much do those both need to be advanced? Like if we're thinking of like scales almost of how much attention needs to be paid to each of those ideas.
That's a good question, Eric. You know, because we would come, most of us, from like a Protestant background where we don't see icons. As you know, I'm from a Roman Catholic background in Latin America, which is very medieval, classic Catholicism, where you have statues of Mary and the saints, pilgrimage to these sites, and you'll see people kneeling in front of statues. So you're actually getting a visual, which you don't find in Protestant circles. You know, that was one of the pillars of the Reformation. So I think that's one of the things that makes it hard for people to imagine because they associate, naturally so, idolatry with statues. Well, but we don't see them. We might drive by a Catholic church and there may be a statue of Mary outside or something like that, but we don't, we just drive by. And even in Catholic churches in this country, you'll see the icons, but it's functioning differently than it would in Latin America. I mean, if you go to a Latino Catholic church, you'll see it, you see, but in an Anglo Catholic church, you won't see it. So I think part of the issue is because we don't grow up around it, or Protestants, though, it doesn't really register. But in the ancient Near East, Israel, they were surrounded by what we would call icons all the time. They were household gods. If you wanted to have children, there'd be a god or a goddess that you would approach for rain, and there was temples everywhere. I mean, so they were used to seeing statues. Okay? And that's why it makes sense when God says in the opening commandment, right, don't make an image. I mean, so that makes sense in that context. Okay. If you think about the North American Protestant context, you know, that first commandment doesn't really make much sense, because you've never seen them. And so, okay, it doesn't register, right? Where in the ancient world and in Latin America, in other places, it registers very much because you're used to seeing it. Okay. And so that's I think part of the problem it can be with Old Testament scholars because it's not part of their reality. I think they're missing the conceptual piece because they go, oh, but we don't have idols, and they were, and so we identify idols necessarily with paganism. And even today, if you go to like India, I've been in India, and you go, I went to a temple of Ganesh, and this is the one who has the human body and the elephant head. And I was in a temple just, to visit and see. So, I mean, you see it, you see. Um, but most Westerners, or at least the Protestant, just don't see it. So it won't process the same way.
Yeah, that's all interesting to think about. I think I
Yeah, yeah,
personally probably need to take a little more time now that I have more clarity on that.
yeah,
But
yeah.
that's an interesting thing. I wonder if we, thinking back to the prophets, I so I'm using the phrase the prophets. Prophetic times, though, is like several hundred years speaking into different contexts. But it does seem like the goal of each of the prophets is to call the people back to, I guess, righteousness, justice, right relationship with God, right practice of their
Mhm.
religion. Is that uh, an accurate understanding? Is there anything that gets missed when we think about the prophets in that way?
I think I'd say a couple things. One is you're right, calling, to the true religion, but that carries a whole world of things with it that we've been talking about. At the same time, there's some prophets where it's not about calling them back anymore. It's just about announcing judgment. Because what you find in the Old Testament, even in prophets that declare judgment, like the book of Amos, God's been very patient. Uh, but there comes a time when it's just, that's enough. You've kind of crossed the line and there's no going back. So in those same books, you'll have a description of the patience and mercy of God. You'll have the fact that He's tried over the years to call them back, and now they've crossed the line, and there is no turning back. And even with the announcement of judgment, there's the pushback by the people because they refuse to believe that God would actually do that. I mean that, and what you're seeing, I think, um, in those books is something very human. I mean, I'll give you an example. So, um, if you go to a church, whatever kind, and you go to the church leadership and say, you guys are doing it all wrong. We're going to change the services, and we're going to do this and that. Well, um, they're going to push back because they are heavily invested in how that functions now. So if you say we're going to change the music, well, think of all the people that will just affect. We're going to change how we spend the money here. Think of all the things that's going to affect. We're going to change, how we organize the church service. Well, you naturally are going to get pushback. And that's just within the church building. But if you begin now to connect that service to, what the chairman of the board is doing or something like that, I mean, you can just see where the pushback would be massive. Well, that's what you're seeing in the Old Testament. You see where the prophets are challenging the leadership at every level, and they're getting pushback. Jeremiah is put in prison. They try to kill him, right? Amos is told to leave Israel and go back to Judah. I mean, they don't want that. So it is a call to return to God in the proper sense into true worship. But it's wrapped up in judgment. And the thing is that it's not a question of, oh, you need to get the rituals right, because they don't question the rituals. Malachi does, but they don't question the rituals, and they don't call for the elimination of the rituals. You see, the rituals were established by God Himself, so it's not, let's just do away with the rituals, which is kind of the Protestant understanding of it. Oh, God just doesn't like rituals. He just wants worship from the heart. I mean, that's how he processes it, which is missing what's going on. Uh, they're calling for something much more profound, and that's it's a battle ultimately of over God Himself. Who is God? What is He like? And what does He demand? That's the battleground in the prophets.
Yeah, I think Amos is a place where we see that really
Yeah,
distinctly. Is that Amos 5 where like I despise your
yeah,
practices,
yeah,
instead let there be a flood of justice. Like the
yeah.
the
But they're
prac
connected right there. Yeah,
yeah, the practice is being called out, but not because the practice is there. It is because it is not founded upon the ideal that God laid out for the people of Israel.
yeah, and which means that they're going to get Him wrong too. You see, so it's not just they're not doing the right things. Well, they're not doing the right things because they don't have the right view of God Himself. I mean, so they go together. Yeah,
Yeah. So I guess then when the prophets are calling out mistreatment of the quartet of the vulnerable or any other
hmm,
people group inside of Israel's religious practice, is that then what we can think of as they do not understand God because of how they're like the demonstration is demonstrative of their misunderstanding of God?
yeah, I think so. I mean, an easy one for most people, if they don't know the Old Testament really well, is just look what Jesus is doing. He's arguing over interpretations about God and life before God, before and with very committed Jewish people. I mean, so he's not saying you don't believe in God. Oh, they do deeply. He's not saying you're not serious about your faith. They are very serious. But the problem is their view of God. And so part of what Jesus is doing is arguing over that. You need to learn how to pray differently. You need to understand the mercy of God differently. So I mean, you're seeing the same thing going on with Jesus himself.
I wonder with that if we can bring that back and do a conversation about God's judgment and when judgment actually is displayed. There is obviously, I think, people, you see this in the Old Testament, people are surprised and don't want to believe that God's judgment is coming. I
Yeah,
think because they have an understanding, they have worked themselves to an understanding that this is appropriate worship.
yeah,
So, judgment, I think, is something that is very, I don't know if this is just a present day thing, but difficult to interact with
yeah,
because we have this understanding of God not wanting to do that.
yeah.
How do we how do we begin to have that conversation of what God's judgment looks like, what the circumstances when it comes to pass, anything related to that? I think that you have thoughts on.
Yeah, I deal with it in the classroom. So you have these, young people coming in from the culture, and the idea that God would judge at all is distasteful to them. But then you begin to say, well, we judge all the time because we need to in our legal system, our penal system. Why can't God do the same? And they've never thought of it that way, you see. So part of it is getting them beyond the idea that God cannot judge. I mean, that is something that our culture is just hammering. Because if God judges, that means God is a violent God, and we don't like a violent God. I mean, that's. So part of it is getting people to see that and put it into its proper place in the sense that he judges, but this is part of a longer process of patience, and I'm happy to get that if you want. Um, so that they reach a point where they must be judged. I mean, so it's not like God is just kind of a knee-jerk reaction he judges. It's not that way at all. The other thing that is hard for people to understand is that judgment can be corporate. because we're such an individualistic culture, I can be judged, you can be judged, but the idea that God would judge the nation, doesn't seem right because what about all the innocent people? I mean, that's what you'll hear, which I get. But there's a couple of ways to respond to that. I mean, one is if you begin to look at the culture, you begin to see the whole culture is very sick. Now, what I do when I have these discussions, I won't talk about the US directly. I'll get there. But so if you go to like Nazi Germany, that's it. No one's going to defend Nazi Germany, all right?
Or shouldn't.
Or shouldn't, right? But what you see is the complicity is across the board, right? Even with Christians and the established church, and it's not only about anti-Semitism, which is a major component, but it's the whole idea of Germany is a chosen people and this is our destiny. And what you're seeing is it's a whole social construction of how they perceive reality that is being sanctioned and legitimated by the religion. Now, if you think about this country, um, an easy one in a sense would be the whole slavery piece. And we go to civil war over this, and 600,000 people die. I mean, this is just how deep this is. And even, after the Civil War, you have Reconstruction, where you kind of revert. You don't do slavery, but you build a whole system of segregation and exploitation, but it's all legalized, all right? And it goes on for decades. Even today, after all that's been, taken away, you see remnants of this racism in this country. And it's not just limited to blacks. I mean, you could bring in Asians or Latinos. And so what you're seeing is, and that's just one component of the culture. I mean, we could just talk about all kinds of things that are permeating the whole fabric of the country. And we raise our children in this and they absorb it and they perpetuate it. Now, biblically, and I think realistically, there are some people who are most responsible for where the country's going, whether it's the president or the Congress or the mayor or the governor. They will be held more accountable because they're the ones kind of making the decisions that will affect literally millions of people. But millions of people will actually support them. I mean, look at the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you look at the Russian side, where this is part of, the motherland and this empire mentality that this is our right. We're taking back what is due to us, and we're fighting the Nazis. I mean, and the Russian Orthodox Church actually is supporting it and blessing it. I mean, you're just seeing something is desperately wrong at the very heart of the culture itself. The same thing in this country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking of a biblical example that I encountered recently, I am not super familiar I just read through First and Second Chronicle, well, not just, somewhat recently read through, and was not super familiar with that part of the Bible, and saw I'm forgetting which one, but when the nation splits, so it becomes the northern and southern kingdoms, there's a passage that talks about people from the northern kingdom who feel like we are abandoning like appropriate religious practice, like a right understanding of God, and move to the southern kingdom. And I was like, oh, there is example of like individuals inside of the system identifying that it's wrong. But then later on, it says that the leadership in the southern kingdom still leads the entire nation into, I forget exactly, idolatry, like incorrect, appropriate practice. So there is that, like, individuals inside the system can identify it, but the system can still bring you into a place that is outside of the uh, a right understanding of what we're supposed to be doing and how we're supposed to be practicing our
Yeah,
faith.
yeah, good. That's very good. Yeah, I mean, it's common sense, actually. If you just begin to think anthropologically or sociologically, we shouldn't be surprised by any of this. And it's not just limited to Christianity. I mean, there's certain forms of Islam, for instance, which are very nationalistic, right? And militantly so. You're seeing in India the rise of militant Hinduism. I mean, this is what humans do with their religion. And you go back to the ancient world, and it was the same thing. I mean, so humans will use their religion and create a religion that reflects who they are, and then they will, you know, uh, use that to expand or to conquer. I mean, that's been the history of the world.
I wonder if we could talk here a little bit about maybe bridging a testamental gap, if you will, from Old Testament to New Testament. Because I think, speaking of sort of modern day Protestantism, I think there are places where there's sort of a writing off of the Old Testament as this has been fulfilled in Jesus. And so we don't necessarily need to think about things as much that come out of the Old Testament. But I think we've already identified here that some of these things are just part of the character of God. And so that in and of itself leads importance to it. But then, as you mentioned, we see this also in the demonstration of Jesus through his ministry here on earth. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what we do see from Jesus that is reflected from, or that reflects upon what we see in the prophets of calling the nation back into, I guess, specifically the calling portion back into righteousness.
Let me expand that conversation a little bit because, again, being in the classroom, I hit this. And I hit it in a couple different ways. One is, we're not the covenant people, so therefore the Old Testament isn't relevant. You'll get that. Or everything's fulfilled in Jesus, and Jesus is in every chapter of the Bible. I mean, you'll get that. Um, and they're very sincere about it, and there's all kinds of systems and institutions that actually follow that line. Sometimes I'll give you an example, and it just changes a bit of the conversation. So when you go into um, the Old Testament, chapter 1, humans are made in the image of God. And so that's going to establish a connection between God and humanity that's very unique. All right. And so if we think about that, then it should not surprise us that God will become a human being. Okay? If we're made in his image and we're moving toward redemption, it makes sense that to have that happen and for God to reclaim humanity for himself, that he would become human. Now, when you go into the prophets and the rest of the Old Testament, but I mostly work in the prophets, but you're seeing so much suffering and war. War, we don't know what war is. We haven't had war on U.S. soil since the Civil War, literally 160 years ago. Well, if you're in Ukraine or if you're in Iran or Iraq or if you're in Nigeria where your churches are being burned, and war is something that you know and you've actually lived, all right? And you've seen the cruelty, you've seen the destruction. And so in the Old Testament, war was a fact of life. And they knew what war meant. It was hand-to-hand combat. It was incredibly cruel. And what the empires would do is that they would destroy the cities, they would sometimes put salt into the ground so you couldn't grow crops. It wasn't just about winning the war, it was destroying you as a people. They would cut down the fruit trees, all these things. And it would take years for those fruit trees to be able to give fruit again. I mean, so what you're seeing is a level of destruction. And then there's a couple of passages in the Old Testament, well, Book of Lamentations, where you're seeing the fruit of a siege, which is horrific. You know, starvation, disease, all these things. So with so much suffering, what you need is a God who understands suffering. You need that, you see. And so for me, what you have is the need for a God made flesh who understands human suffering. Not only in a redemptive sense, which it will be, which is where people in this country kind of stop the conversation. You know, Jesus had to die because of, you know, the law and you need sacrifice for sin and blood. Okay, I get that. That's not enough. So you need a God who actually suffers, you see, who understands the human condition and is not just paying the penalty for my sin, which is, you know, I go to a church, I go to an Anglo church in the morning and a Latino church in the afternoon. In the Latino church, it's very much of this Jesus is everything kind of. So every sermon ends with Jesus. It's always about the cross. And I don't have anything against that, but it's a very limited view. You know, he paid for my sin. He removed my guilt. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. But it's so much more than that. So what you're seeing is the Old Testament is creating the need for someone like Jesus to appear. And so you're changing the conversation about the Old Testament. The other thing the Old Testament gives us that the New Testament doesn't as fully is the realities of human politics and warfare and international relations. I mean, which is part of the human reality. See? The New Testament is focused on, in the Gospels, on Jesus in what we would now call Israel, Palestine, and then in these letters, right? Uh, it's not about a nation state. You know, you'll get some of that in the book of Revelation. So, and you'll get hints at it, you know, where Jesus is Lord, you know, not Caesar. I mean, you'll get this kind of stuff kind of in the background, but in the Old Testament, it's front and center. So, I mean, we need the Old Testament for a fuller view of God and for a fuller view of human sin. So, you know, I think it just changes the whole discussion of what we do with the Old Testament. But because in some circles you're so focused on the redemptive piece that it can be very limiting for appreciating the fullness of the revelation of God. The fact that Jesus and the writers of the New Testament are constantly quoting the Old Testament, constantly. It's showing you just how central it is even to their understanding of faith and to their identity. So, you know, uh, well, with Jesus, everything is fulfilled. Yeah, but Jesus is quoting the Old Testament all the time, and it's not just about fulfillment. You know what I'm saying? So, but that's how people think, you know, and I can understand historically why they went that way. But now in this country, there's certain movements that really are forceful about that, and I think they can lose a lot of what the Old Testament can provide. But I mean, Jesus is a prophet. He speaks like a prophet, and actually, when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They say, "Well, they say you're a prophet," and he is. Um, So you're seeing the echoes of the Old Testament. He's acting like an Old Testament prophet, and like the other ones in the Old Testament, some of whom were killed, he is. You know, even Jesus, when he's coming into Jerusalem, says, "Oh, Jerusalem, you know, how I would love, you know, to embrace you, but you kill your prophets. And of course, that will be his fate as well. So I think we minimize, we don't understand. I mean, the book of Revelation is full of Ezekiel and Zechariah imagery. Without that, you know, you're not going to understand a lot what's going on. So, yeah, I hear what you're saying a lot in the classroom and in local churches. It makes theology a lot easier because it's very simplified. But life isn't simple. My life isn't simple, and the world isn't simple. And we need a word that's as complex as life itself.
Yeah, and maybe if I to provide my own commentary a little bit, maybe on that or own observations, if the focus is so much on sort of like an eternal, further out in the future redemption, that allows us to think less about now and about what we're doing now, which is especially convenient if we are creating God in our image and wanting to do things the way that we want to do things
Yeah,
and have that be blessed by this image of God that we have.
yeah.
I wonder here probably as we're coming to a close then maybe to turn this to like an application sort of question. If we're I mean we being any Christian who might be listening to this are inside of a system which makes it difficult to recognize the justice of God, what that actually looks like in practice. How do we then develop ways to actually see what is appropriate? How do we interrogate our own practice and belief? Are there ways from the prophets that we can, maybe from the prophets specifically, that we can identify ways to develop this, or just any other spot that you can think of that helps us think through that?
You know, it's a hard one, Eric, because people are so formed into thinking a certain way about the Bible, and it's sometimes it's their devotional literature, it's the kind of sermons we hear, it's the songs that we sing, it's the conferences we go to. And sometimes I think they're perpetuating misreadings, but this is all people know, right? So, you know, true confessions here. I don't read Christian devotional literature. On the one hand, I just don't have the time because I'm working on other stuff. And if I want to read literature, I just read, you see back in here, there's these two Quixotes, you know, Don Quixote de la Mancha. And up in here, this is all Spanish literature, right? And over here, you won't see it, but there's a statue of Charles Dickens. It's a bust of Dickens. And so this is all Dickens, okay, and other things. And so I'm reading other kinds of literature. I love mysteries, and so I've just started another mystery last night. So, so I don't read, um, you know, Christian devotional literature. I just don't have the time, or because some of it to me sometimes it just misses the boat so much that I don't, you know, I don't find much help in it. Um, so that's the challenge. I mean, how do you reorient a whole way of thinking and a whole industry of publications and of songs? And I mean, it's very difficult. You know, students will hear me in class, and you know, you've heard this. So I don't have a solution. You know, maybe one way of doing it is you know to read the Bible instead of some of this other stuff. Um, yeah, so I'm not sure I can give you you know, a cookie cutter. You know, here's three steps. you know. I think maybe just ask different questions of the text. I mean, who is God in this text? How is it different than what I have been taught or what I think? What is he demanding of me? And who is the person of God here? You see, I think if you start asking different questions, that can help. But, to be perfectly frank, you're going to be doing it uh, in environments that may, not lead you there naturally. It's like, we had the conversation about immigration. Well, how many churches even have that conversation? I'll be doing a Zoom call on this coming Sunday for a church in Wisconsin, Sunday afternoon, so we can have that conversation. But they're not normal. Um, and what makes it more difficult in this country now is that this country is so polarized ideologically that seeps into the church, and so sometimes you can't have that conversation because it'll trigger things, or you have the conversation, but it's so ideologically driven that it really isn't helpful. So that it's a whole series of challenges that I can't give you a nice cookie cutter, like I said, 3-step. This is how you do it. I think that the easiest thing is just read the Bible and ask it. So ask yourself, what is the question the Bible is asking? Instead of how can I fit this into my system, which is how a lot of people will read it. How do I fit Jesus into here? Well, Jesus isn't there actually, but it'll show you why you need Jesus, but he's not actually there. I mean, that text functioned as scripture for centuries before Jesus even appeared. So it had to function as the word of God before the birth of Jesus. You can't ignore that. So how did it? What was the goal? What was it trying to get at? I mean, though you're asking a different kind of question.
Yeah, which I think is a great identification because the Bible is written to us, but like not first
Yeah,
necessarily.
yeah,
So something is trying to be communicated to the original readers to
yeah.
make that clear. I think another, maybe the last thing here, another thing you just identified with having a shelf full of Dickens works is that there are other places within our culture where things are being called out and identified that I think we can listen to. So someone like Dickens at the time writing about what's happening in England versus or translating that onto
Yeah,
today,
yeah.
where are people calling things out that we can then that can help us ask that question of, well, what does the Bible say? What did the Bible say, and how does that apply now?
There's a Wheaton on the undergrad side will have a book of the year that they will read. And this last year, the book was really profound. When breath becomes air, and it's the story of a brilliant son of immigrants, I think Indian immigrants, neurosurgeon who ends up getting uh, incurable cancer in his 30s, and he's like projecting to be one of the best in the country, and he gets the diagnosis, and it chronicles his dying and his wrestling uh, with God and all. I mean, those are the kind of books that I go, oh, okay. It doesn't turn out well because he knows he's dying. So there's not a happy ending, but there's a profound ending. Yeah, I have the book When Breath Becomes Air. Um, and you can see in the last name, that he's of foreign origin, but it's profound. And there'll be times in the book where you'll be weeping, um, you know. But that to me that's life. We've had several friends die in the last 6 months. Other friends are very sick. Uh, and it just brings everything, it grounds everything. And it's not just yay, yay, Jesus. I mean, no, life is hard. I mean, life has all of its blessings, but we're fallen creatures. We're fragile creatures. And, here I am. I just retired, literally, last weekend. And you begin to go, I'm entering a new stage of life. And this, you start asking different kinds of questions. I mean, but that's the human life, Our days are numbered. When you're your age, you're not thinking about Medicare and, plan A, plan B. Well, we are, so, we lined up our Medicare stuff, within the last few weeks. I mean, we're having conversations, my wife and I, we've been married 50 years in August. We're having conversations we've never had before. Well, that's life. And so, you know, so there we go. I mean, that's what it is. And that's what's so great about the faith, because the faith actually responds to this. And God actually took on flesh. Otherwise, I don't know how we would deal with it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Carroll, for all of that. It, if nothing else, gives me a lot more to think about as a reminder that there's a lot more to learn. So hopefully that'll be something that's helpful for others as well.
Yeah, and I'm always up for a conversation. So let me know.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.